Hey guys, what's up? It's Tanya, and today we're gonna do a PF topic analysis for the April topic, Resolve the United Nations should abolish permanent membership on its Security Council. Before we get started, I just want to say that this is gonna be pretty brief and pretty broad, right? I'm not gonna be giving super specific arguments, but it's hopefully going to be like a helpful primer for if you're starting your research and you're not really sure what to read. As a quick roadmap, we're going to talk about, we'll do some resolutional analysis. We'll talk about what permanent membership is. We're not going to get too much into what the UN is. Then we'll talk about the AFNEG strategy. Then we'll go over some previous topics that might be useful to see the wiki of. And that's pretty much it. Also, there are some terms that you might want to know before we get started that you might hear me say. You might not remember them necessarily if you don't do like a non-PF debate format. Since this is a policy topic, we're skipping ahead a little bit, it's a policy topic, I will be referring to uniqueness and stuff like that, like advantage, disadvantage structure. And if you're not super familiar with that, there's a video, I'll put the link in the description. And same thing for, I'm going to be referencing, I think I'm not telling you to run a counterplan, to be clear, but I'll be referencing the concept of counterplans, and I'll be talking about fiat a little bit. Neither of those will be super in depth, right? But if I'm talking, you're like, I don't really know what she's talking about right now, you could check out those videos and maybe it'll make it a little bit clearer. With that said, let's get started. Like I just said, policy topic, actor in action. What's nice about this topic is even though in PF you can't have a specific plan, there's really only one topical action, which is to just fully abolish permanent membership, which means as the negative, you're gonna have very stable links, or links to the affirmative. Again, there's not a plan, but I'm gonna refer to it as a plan just for the sake of simplicity, but I know it's not really a plan. You'll have stable links to the AF regardless, and I feel like even as the affirmative, it makes it a little bit easier because you know exactly what you're defending, so I think that's nice. I'm not gonna get super into what the UN is or how it works. There's lots of information on that. There's lots of even YouTube videos explaining it, but we can talk for a second about what permanent membership on the Security Council is. So there's 15 countries that are on the UN Security Council. 5 of them are permanent members. The other 10 rotate every 2 years. So every year, 5 members switch. So it's staggered. There's 10 rotating members, 5 permanent members. Those permanent members are the US, the UK, France, China, and Russia. And those permanent members are obviously permanent, but they also have veto power. So they can veto any resolution. It needs to be unanimous among Security Council members in order for stuff to pass. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So if the AF happens, that means that those members would no longer be permanent, they'd be rotating, they wouldn't have that veto power. Okay, I have some general pros and cons for the UN, right? I'm not going to get super specific, partly so that you do your own research and stuff, but also because this is a pretty prescient, the right word, very topical, very current topic, and there is a chance that what I say won't even be really accurate or relevant by the end of the month, so I'm just not going to say anything. There's some general cons, you can just read them. And then let's get into some strategy ideas. So overall let me check my notes. Yeah, on the AF and the NEG, you can say UN good or you can say UN bad, but you want to make sure that you're still your uniqueness is still in the right direction. What I mean by that is when you're affirmative, you're still arguing that the status quo is bad, even if you're saying the UN is good. And when you're the negative, you're still arguing that the status quo is good, even if you're arguing that the UN is bad. And we'll get more into that in a second. Another tip I guess I have, another thing that I would do if I was debating this topic is I know this isn't super or maybe it is now, but to my understanding, it's not super common in public forum to prep multiple cases for each side, but I think that could be helpful here, right? And just decide whether you're gonna read your like UN good stuff or UN bad stuff, depending on like what judge you have and what your opponent reads. I think that could be helpful. I think it's helpful in general, but I think it would be especially helpful on this topic. And finally, do not read UN good and UN bad at the same time, right? You're not going to simultaneously be saying the UN is good and we should reform it, and the UN is awful and we need to get rid of it altogether. So with that, let's get into the affirmative. So on the F, like I said before, UN good, UN bad, kind of your two options. So first, UN good. Your first option is to say the UN is like good or can be good, but it can do good things. We just need to reform it in some way. And like not in some way, by abolishing permanent membership. So you would start off by saying the UN is bad, or part of it is bad because of permanent membership specifically, right? Not a general problem with the UN, something specific to permanent membership. And then you would argue that getting rid of permanent members solves this, and now the UN is good, and the UN will do good things. What's important here is, one, like it says on the slide, make sure your evidence is saying specifically that permanent membership is what's causing the problem, because if it doesn't, it's pretty easy for the neg to say you don't solve. And if you're the negative and you notice that your opponent doesn't have evidence specifically saying their problem is caused by permanent membership, you can say they don't solve. But second, you're gonna need some kind of evidence saying that the permanent members either like won't be upset by this or won't like react negatively, right? You're gonna want some evidence or some explanation at least of why permanent members won't like pull out of the UN if they lose permanent membership. That's important. Second, option number 2 is to just say that the UN is terrible altogether. The UN is just all around bad. It'll always be bad. It can never be good. But if we get rid of permanent members, those permanent members will pull out. They will pull out. They'll pull their funding. They'll leave the UN altogether. And this will collapse the UN, which is good because the UN is bad, right? And if you're reading this, you don't need to have Security Council specific or permanent membership specific uniqueness, right? You're just talking about how the UN altogether is bad because you're collapsing the whole UN. It doesn't need to be super specific uniqueness wise. And then you're going to want answers to you, just like obviously like the UN is good, it does good things, or it can be reformed. And you're probably going to need answers to the argument that if the UN was to collapse, it would just either be replaced the way that like the League of Nations was replaced with the UN, or that the harms that you're describing will just continue because they're still like hegemons and stuff, right? That it's not specifically because of the UN that the problems that are being described will happen. Or you could argue that the replacement to the UN would be better than the current UN. That's also an option. But you need like some answer to that kind of like, I guess, fill-in argument. So I know I said there were 2 strategies, but I lied. There's actually a third option. And this option is kind of like to combine those 2 things. So you would still be arguing that the UN is capable of doing good things, but you would also be arguing that these permanent members do leave, and you would be saying that like that is what's bad about the UN, is that the permanent members are in the UN at all, and if they were to leave, that would just like solve all the problems that the UN has. Yeah, this was kind of a last minute addition. I haven't done a ton of research on this one. I don't know if anyone is saying that like these countries should be removed from the UN altogether. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. So that's why this is a bonus one. It's not like an official option. But if you can find stuff that says this, I think it's a viable strategy for sure. All right, let's talk about the negative. So the same way the affirmative can say that the UN is good and the UN is bad, negative can do the same thing, but remember, we're still saying that the status quo is good either way, and we'll see how that works in a second. So option 1, UN good. you're going to start by finding, what is that? Okay. Start by finding something that the UN is doing well, something that is beneficial, right? Maybe it's like the diplomacy is being fostered, humanitarian aid is being offered, whatever. Something about the UN that is good. And this does not need to be Security Council specific because, like with the second AF strategy, your link here is that the UN collapses altogether. So it could be about any part of the UN. Just something good. Then you say, pull out collapses the UN. UN Security Council members pull funding, they remove it, they leave altogether. Also, so technically it violates the UN Charter to remove permanent members of the Security Council. The UN Charter has been amended before, but any amendment requires all of the permanent members to vote yes, which I would argue would not happen. So I would argue that the AF happening would have to happen in violation of the UN Charter, which would also delegitimize the UN Charter, which also would lead to like the UN kind of being defunct. So with that said, you might be thinking, Tanya, what about fiat? Can't the affirmative just fiat that the charter is amended? Like, I guess if this was a different format of debate, but right, they don't actually have a specific plan text. And also, even if they did, I think you can still make the argument that these permanent members agreeing to be removed is such like a far-fetched scenario that it's just not educational to discuss it, right? So one, they don't have a plan, they don't get to fiat that it happens in a specific way, right? You're just discussing the most likely way this topic would happen. And secondly, it's more educational to talk about it as if these members would react negatively, because that's realistically what they would do. But secondly, it doesn't really matter too much, like the charter stuff, even without it violating the UN Charter. I think the like permanent member freakout stuff still like works. And they definitely, even if they can fiat like the affirmative, they cannot fiat that like all the permanent members are also like cool with it afterwards, that they amend the charter and they're like, yeah, actually, I don't want to be a permanent member anymore. This is all good, right? They're gonna be upset about it. And like, that's why Russia wasn't able to be removed from the Security Council after, like, the invasion of Ukraine, even though I think it was, like, the president of Ukraine was like, you gotta get them out of here. It's because in order for Russia to be removed, Russia would have to vote yes on being removed, and that would never happen. So they didn't even try. So I think that alone is a good enough warrant for, like, why these countries don't want to be removed from or don't want their permanent membership to be removed, I guess. So yeah, that's that. Your second negative strategy could be like a masking dissad or masking contention, whatever you're gonna call it. And for this, you would be arguing that the UN is bad, but you would be arguing that the UN is like failing or collapsing or becoming like irrelevant now in the status quo, and that's good because the UN is bad. Second, you would be saying that the affirmative would boost UN credibility without actually solving anything. That's bad because now credibility is resolved even though the UN is still bad, and the UN will continue to do whatever bad thing you talk about in the uniqueness. Pretty straightforward stuff, but again, you have to argue that the UN is collapsing the status quo. And similarly, you can argue, if you're doing the UN good stuff, that like reform is already happening. If you can find evidence saying that like there's some sort of reform or some changes happening in the UN, that's probably a good argument to read. Which actually kind of brings us to our other two things, which is, right, you probably want to read some kind of defense. If you're reading the masking stuff, you might want to read arguments saying like there's still bribery, there's still like other ways that there's still like a lack of enforcement overall. There's other things that make the problems that the affirmative is discussing happen. And then for first, what's it called? Yeah, just the first one. you might not want to read that, like, the UN will continue to, like, be super corrupt, right? But you can still read arguments that, like, the problems that they're talking about aren't a result of permanent membership, they're a result of something, or a result of something else. Yeah, that was the right word. Okay. Secondly, as the negative, you can argue that there is a better way to solve the affirmative. This is not a counterplan. I'm not suggesting that you read a counterplan and get, like, banned for life from every PF tournament. What I'm saying is you can suggest to the judge that even if they believe that the affirmative is onto something about there being a problem with the status quo, there are still better ways to solve for the status quo. So some examples that I gave were removing a specific member, increasing number of security council members, just removing veto powers and adding more. Okay, I see. Number 2 is saying, like, more temporary members, like increase the, like, rotating number, and then 4 would be adding more permanent members. You could also, like, maybe, like, increase the terms of the non-permanent members, stuff like that. There's a lot of options for you. Just make sure that it's not, like, biting your disad, right? It's still avoiding the contentions. If you're arguing that removing members from the Security Council would cause, like, a freak out, and then your better alternative is to, like, remove just the US's permanent membership, that would probably still cause the US to pull out and pull funding and still, like, collapse the UN, or at least, like, significantly harm it, right? So you want to make sure whatever alternative you're reading doesn't have the same problem. Same way if you're, like, reading the second thing and you're saying we should increase the number of permanent members, how is that not also, like, a masking thing if the UN is just super, super bad? Again, you're not fiating this, right? So it's not, like, binding. It's just a potential option, but that's something that you want to avoid. In order for it to be, like, an effective argument, you want to make sure that you're not, like, contradicting yourself. Yeah, and again, you're not fiating, you're just saying, judge, even if you buy that the affirmative is right and there is some things about the UN that are bad, or there's something about the world right now that's bad, there are other ways to solve this. So it's not a question of just, like, either we keep things the same forever or we do the AF. There's still other better ways to solve. So you should take the disadvantages that we're presenting seriously, because there are other ways we can resolve, better ways. All right, so let's get into some old topics that I think are relevant. As a disclaimer, I am not saying to go to the wiki and just start stealing stuff, partly because I just don't want to endorse that, but secondly because I think the most recent topic on this list is from 2019, so it's a little bit outdated. There's a couple of things that have happened since then that I think might be relevant to the topic, and I would recommend you consider those things. But okay, so these 3 are the ones that I think will be the most relevant. The April PF topic from 2019 is resolved. The UN should grant India permanent membership on the Security Council. I think it's pretty obvious why I chose this one. Probably has some, like, Security Council good and Security Council, or permanent membership good, permanent membership bad stuff. Granting India to the granting India permanent membership is a potential alternative that you could suggest, and there's probably, like, solvency evidence for that here. And just, like, general UN good, UN bad stuff. The second one I put is the Jan-Feb LD topic from 2019. Resolved, the United States ought not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes. The US is a permanent member, and at least the affirmative is probably going to be arguing in this, on this topic, that the U.S. is providing aid to authoritarian regimes, right? And that could be a potential argument on the app that you're making about, like, enforcement and the way that it allows for certain countries to provide military aid to authoritarian regimes. Third, there's the high school policy topic from 2019. The U.S. FG should reduce direct commercial sales and or foreign military sales of arms from the United States. pretty much the same thing as before. There's some like bonus topics I put. This is like, even the previous page was pretty subjective. This is like extra subjective. So depending on what you are arguing, you may feel differently about what topics are relevant, and you should go and look at like previous topic lists and see what you feel is relevant. But this is stuff that kind of stuck out to me as things that might have evidence that would be useful. So November, December, LD topic from 2017, resolved wealthy nations have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations. That's like what people argue like the function of the UN should be, or one of the functions of the UN should be. So I think that would be pretty relevant. The 2016 policy topic, resolved the United States federal government should substantially increase its economic and or diplomatic engagement with the People's Republic of China. Those are two permanent member states right there. So I think there's probably something useful there, especially if you can argue that the UN facilitates cooperation between the US and China. And then finally, there's just a list of like college policy topics that are like foreign policy topics. I think the ones that I specified are the ones that involve permanent members, I think. And then, oh yeah, the current topic is like the nuclear topic, like the United States should like restrict nuclear arsenal or size or something like that. And that might be relevant if you're reading like nuke war impacts. I don't know. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope this was helpful. That's it. Hopefully it was helpful. If not, I think that's the same thing I said last time. I hope that doesn't become like that's a weird outro to have. That becomes, I'm gonna say something else. That's it. Thank you for watching. If you have questions, you can ask. I think I said this in the, whatever. If you have questions, you can ask in the comments. Hopefully this was helpful. Thanks.